"You're not family anymore. Get out." Michael's voice cut through the warm kitchen air like a blade through butter. The turkey sat golden and untouched on the dining room table while his words hung in the air, poisonous and final. My hands, still dusted with flour from the pie I'd brought, trembled slightly as I set down my purse. The smell of cinnamon and nutmeg from my homemade dessert mixed with the sharp scent of his anger, creating a nauseating cocktail that made my stomach turn. The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock I'd given them for their anniversary. My daughter-in-law Sarah stood frozen by the stove, her face pale as winter snow. The children had been sent upstairs, but I could hear their confused whispers floating down through the heating vents. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird, each beat echoing in my ears louder than thunder. The familiar kitchen, where I'd taught Michael to make pancakes 30 years ago, suddenly felt like enemy territory. Michael's face was twisted with rage, his neck veins bulging like garden hoses about to burst. His expensive suit, the one I'd helped him buy for his promotion, was wrinkled from his aggressive gestures. Spittle flew from his lips as he continued his verbal assault, landing on the granite countertop I'd admired so many times before. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look like a stranger wearing my son's face. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides, and I found myself calculating the distance to the front door. I straightened my spine slowly, feeling each vertebra align like dominoes falling in reverse. My voice, when it finally came, was steady as a mountain stream, cool and clear and deceptively calm. The words flowed from somewhere deep inside me, a place I'd kept locked away for far too long. "I see," I said, smoothing my gray cardigan with deliberate care. My fingers found the small leather notebook in my pocket, the one I'd been keeping for months now. The one he didn't know about yet. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was the only sound as I picked up my purse with movements as precise as a surgeon's. I walked to the front door, my low heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd helped them refinish last spring. At the threshold, I turned back, my hand resting on the brass doorknob that suddenly felt cold as ice against my palm. "Thanksgiving isn't over yet, Michael," I said quietly, my words carrying a weight he couldn't quite understand. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but the sound echoed in my chest like a starting pistol. The steering wheel felt slick under my sweaty palms as I sat in their driveway, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't turn the key. Through the living room window, I could see Michael pacing like a caged tiger, his arms gesticulating wildly as he spoke to Sarah. The warm glow from their expensive lamps made the scene look peaceful from outside, a perfect family tableau that masked the ugliness within. My chest felt tight, each breath coming in short gasps that fogged up my car windows. The leather seats that had once felt luxurious now seemed to cling to my skin like plastic wrap. I forced myself to breathe deeply, counting to 4 on each inhale just like Dr. Martinez had taught me during those sessions Michael didn't know about. The November air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of burning leaves from someone's yard down the street. As my hands steadied, I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out the small recording device I'd started carrying 3 months ago. The red light blinked steadily, confirming that every word of Michael's outburst had been captured in perfect digital clarity. My mind drifted back to the conversation I'd overheard 2 weeks earlier, when I'd arrived early to babysit and found Michael on the phone in his study. His voice had been different then, calculating and cold as he discussed the old lady problem with someone he called his financial advisor. The memory of those words still made my skin crawl like insects were walking across my arms. I'd stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the cool wall, as he outlined his plans for my future with clinical precision. That night, I'd sat in my small apartment, staring at the stack of legal documents I'd been quietly organizing for months. My background in corporate accounting, the career Michael always dismissed as just paperwork, had taught me to read between the lines of financial statements. The patterns were there, clear as daylight to someone who knew what to look for. Bank statements with irregular transfers, forged signatures on checks, medical bills that didn't match my actual treatments. My son had been systematically stealing from me while planning to have me declared incompetent. The irony wasn't lost on me as I finally started the car engine. Michael thought he'd just banished a helpless old woman from his life, clearing the path for his scheme. What he'd actually done was free me from the need to pretend I hadn't noticed his betrayal. The game had changed, and he didn't even realize we were playing yet. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, watching his house shrink in my rearview mirror, and smiled for the first time in weeks. My apartment felt smaller than usual when I walked through the door, the silence pressing against my eardrums like deep water. The familiar scent of lavender from my diffuser couldn't quite mask the lingering smell of defeat that seemed to cling to my clothes. I hung my coat in the closet with mechanical precision, each movement deliberate and controlled. The normalcy of the action felt surreal after the chaos of the afternoon, like trying to resume a conversation after someone had screamed fire in a crowded theater. I moved to my kitchen table, where months of careful documentation waited in neat manila folders, each one labeled in my precise handwriting: bank records, medical bills, legal correspondence, phone records. The paper felt crisp under my fingertips as I spread them across the wooden surface, creating a mosaic of my son's betrayal. The evidence was overwhelming now, a mountain of proof that would make any prosecutor smile with satisfaction. My reading glasses slipped down my nose as I reviewed the timeline I'd been building, each entry a small dagger aimed at Michael's carefully constructed lies. The phone rang at exactly 7:30, cutting through my concentration like a chainsaw. Michael's voice was different now, smoother, almost apologetic. He spoke about holiday stress and family tensions, his words coated with artificial sweetness that made my teeth ache. "I think we should talk, Mom," he said, and I could hear the calculation behind his concern. Sarah must have reminded him that angry outbursts could be remembered later, especially by someone he was planning to have declared mentally incompetent. I let him talk, making appropriate sounds of hurt and confusion while my free hand traced the edges of the conservatorship petition I'd found in his briefcase last month. The document was thorough, painting me as a confused old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. It cited examples of forgetfulness and poor judgment that I'd never exhibited, supported by medical records from doctors I'd never seen. The lies were so detailed and convincing that even I might have believed them if I hadn't known they were fiction. "Why don't you come for dinner tomorrow?" Michael continued, his voice warm with false affection. "We can work this out like a family." I agreed with the trembling voice he expected to hear, playing the role of the wounded mother desperately hoping for reconciliation. But as I hung up the phone, my reflection in the dark window showed a woman whose eyes held no confusion, only cold determination. Tomorrow night would indeed bring a family reunion, but not the kind Michael was expecting. The next evening, I arrived at Michael's house carrying a store-bought apple pie and wearing my most confused grandmother expression. Sarah answered the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her movements jerky with nervous energy. The children greeted me with cautious hugs, their innocent faces reflecting the tension that hung in the air like smoke. Michael appeared from his study, arms spread wide in theatrical welcome, his performance of the loving son almost convincing enough to fool someone who hadn't heard his true voice the night before. Dinner was a masterpiece of false normalcy, with Michael playing the attentive son while Sarah fussed over my plate like I was an invalid. They spoke in careful tones about my health, my living situation, my ability to manage daily tasks. Each question was a fishing expedition, designed to elicit responses they could later use as evidence of my declining mental state. I played along perfectly, allowing slight confusion about dates, struggling to remember the names of my neighbors, forgetting small details about recent conversations. When I excused myself to use the bathroom, I made a deliberate wrong turn toward Michael's study. "Oh dear, I got turned around," I said loudly enough for them to hear, while my hands worked quickly through the papers on his desk. The conservatorship folder had grown thicker since my last glimpse, filled with fake medical assessments and witness statements from people who barely knew me. My fingers moved with practiced efficiency, photographing each page with a small camera hidden in my purse. The most damning evidence sat in a sealed envelope marked "Power of Attorney, Final Draft." Inside was a document that would give Michael complete control over my finances, my medical decisions, and my living arrangements. The language was cold and clinical, reducing me to a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. My hands remained steady as I photographed each page, but inside, something broke and reformed, harder and sharper than before. I returned to the dining room with shuffling steps and a worried expression, apologizing profusely for my confusion. Michael patted my hand with condescending gentleness, assuring me that these little mix-ups were nothing to worry about. His touch made my skin crawl, but I squeezed his fingers gratefully, playing the role of the grateful mother who couldn't see the trap closing around her. As I drove home that night, I thought about how perfectly his arrogance was serving my purposes. Dr. Patricia Williams looked exactly like what she was, a sharp criminal defense attorney who'd built her reputation on impossible cases. Her office on the 15th floor overlooked the city, and the view through her windows made everything below seem small and manageable. When I'd called her office 3 weeks earlier, her secretary had tried to shuffle me off to a junior partner, assuming I was just another elderly client with a simple estate issue. Now, as she reviewed my carefully organized documentation, her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine amazement. "Mrs. Patterson, this is remarkable," she said, her fingers trailing across the chronological timeline I'd prepared. "Most people don't notice this kind of financial manipulation until it's too late." Her voice carried the respect of one professional recognizing another, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. The late afternoon sun streaming through her office windows felt warm against my back, a sharp contrast to the cold calculation that had driven me to her door. I explained my background in corporate accounting, how I'd spent 30 years catching exactly this kind of fraud for major corporations. Michael had made the mistake of assuming that retirement had dulled my skills, that age had made me soft and trusting. What he hadn't realized was that love had made me careful, not careless. Every discrepancy he thought I'd missed had actually been catalogued and verified, every lie carefully documented with the patience of someone who'd learned long ago that the best traps are built slowly. Dr. Williams leaned back in her leather chair, her silver hair catching the light as she processed what I'd told her. "The beauty of this case," she said slowly, "is that he's created most of the evidence himself. The forged signatures, the fake medical records, the witness statements, they're all going to backfire spectacularly." Her smile was sharp as a scalpel, the expression of someone who genuinely enjoyed watching bullies face consequences for their actions. As I left her office that day, I felt lighter than I had in months. The elevator descended smoothly toward the lobby, and I watched the floor numbers tick by like a countdown. Michael was hosting another family dinner this weekend, another opportunity for me to play the confused old woman while gathering the final pieces of evidence. The irony was delicious. He thought he was manipulating me into compliance, when actually he was providing me with everything I needed to destroy him. Saturday evening found me back at Michael's house, this time with a homemade casserole that I'd accidentally oversalted. Sarah took one bite and tried to hide her grimace, while Michael made a show of eating it with apparent enjoyment, his face a mask of patient tolerance. The children pushed the food around their plates with the resigned expressions of kids who'd learned not to hurt Grandma's feelings, and I apologized profusely for my failing cooking skills. Throughout dinner, I orchestrated a masterpiece of apparent confusion. I told the same story 3 times, forgot Sarah's sister's name, and asked repeatedly what day it was. Michael and Sarah exchanged meaningful glances across the table, the kind of looks that said, "See how bad she's getting?" My performance was Oscar-worthy, each mistake carefully calculated to reinforce their narrative while giving me access to more evidence of their planning. When I spilled wine on the tablecloth, deliberately, though they couldn't know that, Michael jumped up with exaggerated concern. "It's okay, Mom, accidents happen," he said, his voice loud enough for the children to hear his patience and understanding. Sarah rushed to help clean up, and in the chaos, I slipped the tiny recording device from my pocket and attached it under the dining room table with a small piece of magnetic tape I'd brought for this purpose. After dinner, Michael guided me to the living room for coffee, his hand on my elbow as if I were fragile as spun glass. He spoke softly about his concerns for my welfare, his words carefully chosen to sound loving while planting seeds of doubt about my competence. I nodded sadly, agreeing that maybe I did need more help, that perhaps it would be wise to consider my options before something terrible happened. As I prepared to leave, I made a show of looking for my keys, patting down my pockets with increasing agitation. Michael found them on the kitchen counter and pressed them into my hands with gentle firmness. "Maybe we should think about whether you should still be driving," he said, his voice full of manufactured concern. I agreed with trembling gratitude, promising to be more careful, while inside I smiled at how perfectly he was sealing his own fate. The call came on Tuesday morning, just as I was finishing my coffee and reviewing my bank statements one final time. Michael's voice was tight with false cheer as he explained that he'd made an appointment for me with a wonderful doctor who specialized in helping seniors maintain their independence. Dr. Robert Hayes, according to the business card Michael had left on my counter, was exactly the kind of physician who would provide the medical opinion needed for a conservatorship hearing. I arrived at Dr. Hayes' office dressed in my most vulnerable grandmother costume, a faded floral dress, orthopedic shoes, and a slight tremor in my hands that I'd been practicing for weeks. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and fear, filled with genuinely frail elderly patients who made my heart ache with sympathy. The receptionist spoke to me in the loud, slow voice people use with children and invalids, and I responded with appropriate confusion about my appointment time. Dr. Hayes was everything I'd expected: dismissive, hurried, and clearly more interested in the fee Michael was paying than in my actual well-being. His examination was perfunctory, his questions leading, his manner suggesting he'd already reached his conclusion before I'd entered the room. When he asked about my living situation, my finances, my daily activities, I gave him exactly the answers he wanted to hear: confusion, dependency, a growing inability to manage basic tasks. The hidden camera in my brooch captured every moment of his biased examination, every leading question, every predetermined conclusion. Dr. Williams had been right. Men like this always assumed that elderly women were too simple to understand what was happening to them. He never suspected that I was recording our conversation, that I understood exactly what role he was playing in Michael's scheme, that every word he spoke was building the case that would eventually destroy him. As I left his office, shuffling slowly with my cane for effect, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Michael thought he was tightening the trap around me, when actually I was the one holding all the strings. The appointment with Dr. Hayes would be the last piece of evidence Dr. Williams needed to prove conspiracy and fraud. Now all that remained was waiting for Michael to make his final, fatal move. The legal papers arrived on a gray Thursday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed me the official documents. The conservatorship petition was even more detailed than the draft I'd seen in Michael's study, painting a picture of a woman so mentally incompetent that she posed a danger to herself and others. According to the paperwork, I'd been leaving gas burners on, forgetting to pay bills, getting lost in my own neighborhood, and showing signs of advanced dementia that required immediate intervention. I called Michael with shaking hands, at least, hands that sounded shaky over the phone, and asked him to come over immediately. When he arrived, I was the picture of confused distress, clutching the legal papers with tears streaming down my face. "I don't understand," I sobbed, and for a moment, his expression softened with what might have been genuine regret. But then his training kicked in, and he wrapped me in a hug that felt more like a trap than comfort. "It's for your own good, Mom," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've been struggling, and we're worried about you. This will make sure you get the care you need." He spoke like he was explaining something to a child, his words carefully chosen to sound loving and protective. The performance was flawless, and if I hadn't known the truth, I might have been grateful for his concern. I let him guide me to the kitchen table, where he spread out additional papers: power of attorney documents, medical directives, financial authorizations. Each signature would give him complete control over every aspect of my life, from my bank accounts to my medication. His pen moved across the documents as he marked where I should sign, his manner patient but insistent. "Just a few signatures, Mom, and then you won't have to worry about anything anymore." My hand trembled as I reached for the pen, and I could see the satisfaction in his eyes as he prepared to complete his conquest. But instead of signing, I set the pen down carefully and looked directly into his face. "Actually, Michael," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. The confusion left my face like a mask being removed, and for the first time, he saw me as I really was, not a confused victim, but a woman who'd been planning his downfall for months. Michael's face went through a fascinating transformation as the implications of my words sank in. The confident predator expression melted away, replaced by confusion, then growing alarm as he realized that something fundamental had shifted in the room. I stood up slowly, straightening to my full height, and the tremor in my hands disappeared completely. The change was so dramatic that he actually stepped backward, bumping into the kitchen counter with enough force to rattle the dishes. "You see, dear," I continued, my voice carrying the authority I'd used in boardrooms for 3 decades, "I've been documenting everything. Every forged signature, every fake medical report, every conversation with your bought and paid for doctors." I moved to my filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder, setting it on the table with a solid thump that made him jump. Fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy. The DA is going to have such an interesting case to prosecute. The recording device I pulled from under his dining room table was small but sophisticated, and Michael's eyes widened as he recognized it. "Last Saturday's dinner conversation is particularly enlightening," I said, pressing play. His own voice filled the kitchen, discussing his timeline for having me declared incompetent, his plans for selling my apartment, his amusement at how easily I was being manipulated. The words hung in the air between us like poisonous gas. Sarah appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of voices, and her face went white as she heard the recording. Michael was stammering now, trying to explain, trying to justify, but his words came out as broken fragments that made no sense. I watched him crumble with the same detached interest I'd once brought to auditing corrupt corporations, cataloging each lie he tried to construct as evidence of his desperation. "The beautiful thing about being underestimated," I said, reaching for my phone, "is that people never see you coming." Dr. Williams answered on the first ring, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as I gave her the code phrase we'd arranged. Within minutes, the authorities would be on their way. Michael sank into a chair, his expensive suit rumpled, his face gray with the realization that his victim had become his executioner. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse lobby, watching through the tall windows as Michael was led away in handcuffs. The jury had taken less than 2 hours to find him guilty on all counts: elder fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and attempted theft of assets exceeding $200,000. Dr. Hayes had already pleaded guilty to his role in the scheme, and his medical license was permanently revoked. The satisfaction I felt was quiet but complete, like the deep contentment that comes after finishing a difficult but necessary task. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Jennifer Chen, shook my hand with genuine admiration. "Your documentation made this case bulletproof," she said, her eyes bright with respect. "Most victims never see it coming, and by the time they realize what's happening, it's too late to gather evidence." I thought about all the elderly people who weren't as fortunate as I'd been, who didn't have my professional background or suspicious nature, and felt grateful for the skills that had saved me. Sarah had filed for divorce the day after Michael's arrest, and she'd brought the children to see me the week before the trial. They were confused and hurt, struggling to understand how their father could have planned such cruelty against their grandmother. I held them close and told them that sometimes people make terrible choices, but that love was stronger than greed, and family was defined by care, not blood. The healing would take time, but we would rebuild what Michael had tried to destroy. My apartment felt different now, lighter somehow, as if Michael's betrayal had been a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I'd used the settlement money from the civil suit to establish a foundation for elder fraud prevention, combining my accounting expertise with Dr. Williams' legal knowledge to help other seniors protect themselves from family predators. The work was satisfying in a way that reminded me of my younger days, when catching corporate thieves had been my specialty. As I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing applications for the Foundation's assistance program, I thought about the lesson Michael had learned too late. He'd seen an elderly woman and assumed weakness, but weakness and age aren't the same thing. Experience isn't decline, it's accumulation. And sometimes, the quietest people are the most dangerous opponents, because they've learned that patience and preparation are worth more than anger and impulse. The trap he'd walked into had been 40 years in the making, built with every skill I'd learned, every lesson I'd mastered, every day I'd spent becoming exactly the kind of woman who could smile while watching justice served cold.